racist police officer, driven by prejudice, pulls over a black man and blatantly plants a bag of illegal substances in his car, simply because he believed the man didn't belong in that area. But when the man's true identity is revealed, everything changes. The officer faces not only the crushing weight of justice, but also pays a heavy price for his abuse of power. Subscribe to the channel and like the video. This story is filled with unexpected twists and turns that will leave you questioning everything. Last thing before we start, comment down from where in the world are you watching this story. Thank you, and let's start. Sacramento, bathed in the golden hues of a warm sunset, was a city alive with contrast. The bustling streets hummed with activity, yet a tranquil calm seemed to linger in the air. Among the ebb and flow of traffic, David Collins drove his sleek, luxurious sedan down a familiar road. David, a distinguished black man in his early 40s, exuded a quiet authority in his tailored gray suit. As the director of internal affairs for the Sacramento Police Department, his days were consumed by high-stakes decisions and intricate challenges. Yet, at this moment, as the soothing strains of classical music filled the car's interior, he savored a rare reprieve from the relentless demands of his job. The streets unfolded before him like a well-worn path, a routine drive that offered fleeting peace amid a life of constant responsibility. David was acutely aware of his surroundings, the interplay of shadows from the setting sun, the faint murmur of distant conversations, and the rhythmic hum of engines around him. Everything seemed remarkably serene, a sharp contrast to the storm that was about to descend. As he approached an intersection, the traffic light shifted to yellow. David instinctively slowed, coming to a smooth stop just as the light turned red. But then, a jarring intrusion shattered the calm. The sharp blare of a siren and the piercing flash of red and blue lights filled his rearview mirror. A police car loomed close behind, its presence unmistakable. David's brows furrowed slightly, confusion mingling with curiosity. He glanced in the mirror, his composed demeanor giving away little of the unease creeping into his thoughts. He couldn't recall breaking any laws. Still, his years of experience taught him to remain calm and cooperative. Gently guiding his car to the side of the road, he came to a halt, the classical melody on the radio now a faint whisper against the tension that gripped the air. Rolling down his window, David placed his hands on the steering wheel, a gesture of transparency and caution. His eyes flicked to the mirror as the patrol car stopped behind him. The sound of heavy boots crunching against pavement echoed through the quiet evening. From the car emerged a white officer, his sturdy build and purposeful stride radiating authority. His uniform was pristine, his cropped hair a testament to precision. The officer, Scott Parker, was no novice. With over 15 years on the force, he carried the wear and tear of the job like an invisible badge. But time had hardened him, eroding the dedication that once defined his career. Years of chasing shadows and confronting danger had left scars, some visible, others deeply embedded in his psyche. Memories of a colleague gravely injured in a drug bust haunted him, fueling a growing cynicism. And beneath the surface of his polished exterior, biases had taken root, shaping how he viewed the world and those within it. As Parker approached the car, his eyes scanned the vehicle, a faint sneer curling at the edges of his lips. His gaze landed on David, and in that instant, his expression hardened, a mix of suspicion and arrogance shadowing his face. "Is this your car?" he asked, his tone sharp, the words carrying a weight that went beyond their literal meaning. David met the officer's scrutiny with calm resolve, his voice steady and composed. "Yes, officer," he replied, the evenness of his tone betraying none of the simmering frustration he felt. Parker tilted his head, his eyes narrowing. "It's a nice car," he said, the insinuation hanging thick in the air. "But I'm not sure someone like you could be driving it legally." The statement struck like a slap, its meaning unmistakable. But David didn't flinch. He had encountered prejudice before, and while it stung, he had long learned to temper his reactions. "I always carry the necessary documentation," David said evenly, reaching into the glove compartment with deliberate precision. He handed over his license and registration, his movements calm and deliberate. Parker took the documents but barely glanced at them. Instead, his questions continued, each one laced with a subtle edge meant to provoke. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his gaze fixed on David as though searching for a chink in his armor. David's voice remained steady, his words deliberate. "I live in Sacramento. My address is on the registration in front of you." But Parker wasn't listening. His expression darkened, irritation bubbling beneath the surface. "Let me guess," he said, leaning slightly against the car, his tone mocking. "You're in a hurry to get to some party or some other place." The insinuation was blatant, a ploy to elicit a reaction. But David refused to rise to the bait. His voice was firm but calm as he replied, "I'm on my way home after a long day at work. May I ask why I've been stopped?" The directness of David's question momentarily unsettled Parker. For a split second, the officer hesitated, his smug demeanor faltering. But he quickly recovered, his voice colder now. "You don't need to know that," he said sharply. "I'm the one asking questions here." Parker's overt disdain was unmistakable, his every word and gesture an assertion of power. But David's unyielding composure seemed to unsettle him further. Each calm response was a quiet defiance, a refusal to be diminished. The tension thickened as Parker straightened, gripping the documents in his hand. His eyes bore into David, frustration mounting. Then, as if grasping for control, he declared, "You ran a red light." David's brows lifted in surprise, but his voice remained calm. "Officer," he said, "I stopped when the light turned red. I don't believe I violated any traffic laws." Parker's jaw tightened, the officer leaning closer, his tone lowering to a thinly veiled threat. "Listen," he said, "don't make this harder for yourself." David's gaze met Parker's, unwavering and steady. "I'm not trying to make things difficult, officer," he said firmly. "I simply want to understand why I've been stopped." Parker hesitated, his stance stiffening as if the weight of David's composed responses chipped away at the fragile facade of his authority. Each calm and logical reply felt like a rebuke, a subtle challenge to his power. But rather than retreat, Parker doubled down. Straightening up, he cast his eyes over the car and its occupant, his gaze sharp and searching, as though trying to conjure a reason to escalate. "You know what kind of person you are," Parker sneered, his voice thick with sarcasm and disdain. "I don't need you teaching me how to do my job. People like you always think the law doesn't apply to them. So, honestly, I'm not surprised." The words landed with the force of a slap, their intent unmistakable. This wasn't about a traffic stop anymore. It was a performance of prejudice, Parker's disdain laid bare for the first time without pretense. David's grip on the steering wheel tightened slightly, his knuckles brushing against the cool leather. Yet, his expression remained composed, a masterclass in self-control. He recognized the tactic. Parker was baiting him, trying to provoke a reaction that could justify further aggression. But David refused to give him that satisfaction. With a calmness that bordered on defiance, David responded, his voice steady and measured. "If you'd like to search the car, I'm more than willing to cooperate, officer. But I don't think insulting a citizen is an effective way to enforce the law." Parker's laughter was sharp and derisive, the smirk on his face a portrait of mockery. "Don't act like you know it all," he snapped, his tone dripping with condescension. "I know your type. You try to act smart, think you know the law better than the police." David said nothing, his silence a deliberate act of defiance, his gaze unwavering. The tension between them stretched taut, an invisible wire trembling on the verge of snapping. Parker took a step back, his hand brushing against the radio clipped to his belt as though weighing his next move. Then, in a tone that brooked no argument, he barked, "Step out of the car." David took a deep breath, his calm exterior unshaken, though his mind raced with the implications of Parker's demand. His eyes flicked upward to meet Parker's glare, a flash of intensity sparking in their depths. "May I ask for a specific reason, officer?" Parker's lips curled into a sneer, the corner of his mouth twitching with smugness. "I told you to step out of the car," he said, his voice hardening. "Don't make me repeat myself." David realized then that this was no longer a question of procedure or law. Parker had already made up his mind to cast him as a suspect. The stop had become a power play, a clear abuse of authority. The air between them grew thick, oppressive. Parker's posture straightened as he loomed over the car, his gaze as sharp as a blade. "Get out of the car immediately," he commanded, his voice laced with menace. David remained seated for a moment longer, his calm gaze never leaving Parker's. Finally, he spoke, his voice steady and firm. "May I know the specific reason you want me to step out of the car, officer?" Parker smirked, a mocking half-smile that failed to mask the unease creeping into his demeanor. "I don't need to explain myself to you," he said sharply. "Don't make this worse with unnecessary questions." As Parker stepped closer, placing both hands on the car door, his intrusion into David's personal space was deliberate, an unspoken attempt to intimidate. Yet David remained unmoved. Slowly, he reached for the door handle, opening it with deliberate precision. He stepped out, his movements calm and measured, his gaze fixed firmly on Parker. Parker took a step back, but it wasn't out of courtesy. It was to scrutinize David more thoroughly. His eyes roved over David's tailored suit and confident posture, searching for something to criticize. But the polished exterior only seemed to fuel Parker's irritation. "Let me guess," Parker sneered, his voice dripping with venom. "Guys like you always think you're entitled to everything, don't you? Driving fancy cars, dressing sharp, acting like the law doesn't apply to you." The phrase "guys like you" hung in the air, a blatant insult wrapped in thinly veiled prejudice. Its meaning was all too clear. David stood tall, his hands resting calmly at his sides. His expression remained impassive, but his gaze sharpened, cutting through Parker's smugness with quiet precision. "Officer," he said, his tone calm yet carrying a firmness that couldn't be ignored, "I don't believe personal insults are necessary in this conversation." For a moment, Parker hesitated. It wasn't guilt that stilled him, but the unsettling realization that David's confidence was eroding the control he sought to impose. Unused to being challenged, especially by someone he deemed beneath him, Parker pressed on, stepping closer to assert dominance. "You think you know the law, huh?" Parker growled, his tone low and menacing. "People like you always think you can stand up to the police without consequences." David's silence stretched on, a deliberate act of defiance. The weight of his calm was almost tangible, a force that refused to yield under Parker's intimidation. Finally, David spoke, his voice measured and deliberate. "Officer, I'm not standing up to anyone. I'm simply asking to be treated fairly." Parker's dry laugh lacked its earlier confidence, a flicker of unease crossing his face. The authority he sought to wield seemed to slip further from his grasp with each passing moment. Desperate to reassert control, he declared, "I'm going to search your car. Stand still and don't move." David shrugged slightly, his sharp gaze unwavering but showing no resistance. "As you wish, officer," he replied, his tone calm and devoid of fear. David stood firm, his calm voice cutting through the thick air between them. "I'm right here, officer. Do what you need to do." His composed demeanor didn't just maintain his dignity. It created a stark contrast to Parker's escalating aggression. Any bystander observing the scene would have seen the sharp divide between David's controlled professionalism and Parker's desperate attempts to wield authority. For a moment, Parker hesitated. The man before him wasn't crumbling under pressure, wasn't flinching, wasn't giving him the satisfaction of submission. Parker's frustration grew as he realized this wasn't going to be as easy as he'd hoped. "Hands up," Parker barked, his voice sharp and commanding. David slowly raised his hands to shoulder height, his movements deliberate and precise. Parker moved in, frisking him with rough, almost punishing motions. The search wasn't about protocol, it was about dominance. Parker's hands moved with unnecessary force, but David didn't flinch. He stood still, his gaze steady, his expression unreadable. Yet in his sharp eyes, there was a quiet calculation, a mental record of every unnecessary action, every misplaced word. When Parker found nothing suspicious, his irritation was palpable. He stepped back, a fleeting unease crossing his face before it was replaced with his usual smug arrogance. "Stay here. Don't move," Parker ordered, turning his attention to the car. Without cause or warrant, Parker opened the door and began rummaging through the interior. His search lacked the methodical care of a trained professional. It was hasty, careless, less about finding evidence and more about creating it. Then, Parker's hand brushed against the inside pocket of his uniform. His fingers closed around a small bag of white powder, a tool he had brought for just such an occasion. A sinister gleam lit up his eyes as he quickly planted the bag beneath the driver's seat. Dusting off his hands, he stepped back with an air of satisfaction, as though he'd just uncovered incriminating evidence. But what Parker didn't notice was the young woman standing nearby, hidden in the shadows. Her phone was in her hand, camera rolling, capturing every detail of his actions. Her eyes burned with a mix of anger and determination, her steady hand recording not just the moment Parker planted the bag, but every expression on his face, every motion of his hands. As Parker stepped back from the car, his gaze flicked toward the side of the road. He froze for a brief second. The sight of the young woman with her phone pointed at him made his heart skip. A bead of sweat formed on his brow. But rather than stop, he pushed forward, hoping to bluff his way through. "No one will believe her over me," Parker told himself, forcing a smug smile onto his face as he approached David. "Well," Parker drawled, his tone laced with mockery, "it seems you're not as clean as you think." David frowned, his calm exterior showing the slightest crack of suspicion. "If you found anything in my car, officer, I assure you it doesn't belong to me," he said, his voice low and firm. Parker smirked, his grin dripping with defiance. "We'll let the law decide that." Despite his bravado, Parker couldn't shake the unease gnawing at him. The young woman's presence lingered in the back of his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. He turned his attention back to David, his voice sharpening. "You know," Parker began, his tone heavy with disdain, "people like you always think the world revolves around you. Driving fancy cars, wearing expensive suits, thinking that earns you respect. But let me be clear, it doesn't. None of that hides who you are." The words were laden with venom, a direct and unrestrained attack. For a moment, silence hung between them. Then David straightened his posture, his eyes locking onto Parker with a cold intensity. "People like me?" David repeated, his tone calm but carrying an edge that made the words feel like a challenge. "Do you even realize what you just said?" Parker faltered, visibly caught off guard. For a brief second, surprise flashed across his face. But he quickly masked it with a renewed wave of arrogance, covering his discomfort with heightened aggression. "Don't try to deflect," Parker snapped, his voice rising. "I know your type. Always thinking you're smarter than everyone else, thinking the law doesn't apply to you. But let me make one thing clear. You will never be respected, no matter what you do or how hard you try." The words were meant to wound, to break the unshakable calm that David had maintained throughout. But David didn't flinch. Instead, his gaze grew colder, his voice sharper. "You're right," David said, his tone carrying a weight that made Parker pause. "I've always tried to do things the right way. I work hard. I respect the law, and I respect others. But what I'm seeing here isn't law enforcement. This is an abuse of power, and it doesn't represent the values that badge on your chest is supposed to stand for." Parker took a deep breath, his chest tightening with unease. David's words weren't just a protest. They were an indictment, a mirror reflecting the ugliness of his actions. But Parker's pride wouldn't let him back down. "Don't try to act noble with me," Parker snarled, his voice harsher now. "You're no different from anyone else. No matter how well you speak, your true nature is the same. You're untrustworthy, and I'll make sure everyone sees that." David's expression didn't waver. If anything, his calm grew more resolute. He could feel the weight of Parker's hatred, the venom in his words. But he also knew the truth was on his side. And in the shadows, the young woman with the phone had captured every piece of evidence he would need. David took a deliberate step forward, his gaze steady and unwavering. "I don't have anything to prove here, officer," he said, his voice calm yet firm. "But maybe you should ask yourself, who's really untrustworthy in this situation?" The question hit Parker like a gut punch, cracking his veneer of superiority. For a fleeting moment, he was speechless, his carefully constructed facade faltering under the weight of the challenge. Feeling exposed and provoked, Parker's frustration boiled over. Rather than de-escalate, he chose to double down. "Fine," Parker growled, his voice rough with anger. "If you're so smart, then stand there and wait. I'll check everything, and I will find something." David didn't respond immediately. His silence wasn't submission. It was deliberate, calculating. He knew the situation was spiraling out of Parker's control, and he let the tension linger. Parker stood upright, his jaw tight and his eyes burning with a mix of determination and desperation. Finally, he pointed directly at David, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Turn around and place your hands on the car. You're under arrest for suspicious behavior and possession of illegal substances." David raised an eyebrow, his calm expression unbroken, his lips pressed together as if holding back the simmering anger beneath the surface. Instead of complying immediately, David slowly reached into his inner jacket pocket, his movements deliberate and precise. "Don't move," Parker barked, his hand flying to the gun at his hip. His voice was edged with caution, his grip tightening on the weapon. David paused, his gaze steady. His voice was calm, yet commanding. "I'm taking out my badge, officer." "There's no need for alarm," Parker hesitated, confusion flickering across his face. "Your badge?" he repeated, his tone tinged with disbelief but still defiant. David moved with measured precision, pulling out a small leather wallet. He flipped it open to reveal a gleaming badge and an ID card bearing the words, "David Collins, Chief of Internal Affairs, Sacramento Police Department." "You just tried to arrest the Chief of Internal Affairs for Sacramento," David said, his voice low but heavy with authority. The weight of his words seemed to press down on the entire scene, making the air feel heavier. Parker's face turned ashen, his mouth opening and closing without sound. He stared at the badge, then back at David's face, as though unable to process what he was seeing. His breathing grew labored, and a cold bead of sweat rolled down his temple. The confidence that had fueled him moments ago had evaporated, leaving only panic. What is this?" Parker stammered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. His mind raced, scrambling for an escape from the nightmare he had just walked into. David's gaze was unyielding, his eyes fixed on Parker like an unspoken indictment. "You heard me," he said, his tone sharp and measured. "I oversee the conduct of police officers in this city. What I just witnessed isn't law enforcement, it's an abuse of power. A blatant display of prejudice and misconduct." Parker stumbled back a step, his legs unsteady. "I didn't know," he stammered, fumbling for an excuse. "I was just following protocol. I didn't know who you were." David allowed himself a faint, ironic smile. "You didn't know who I was," he said, his tone tinged with quiet amusement. "But that's irrelevant. What matters is how you acted when you thought I had no power." Parker clenched his teeth, his desperation growing. "This is just a misunderstanding," he muttered weakly, but the words rang hollow. David stepped closer, his presence towering over Parker's crumbling composure. "A misunderstanding?" he repeated, his voice low and deliberate. "You abused your authority, fabricated evidence, and demeaned me, all because you assumed I didn't deserve respect. This isn't a misunderstanding, Officer Parker. This is a question of ethics and professionalism." Parker stood frozen, the weight of David's words crushing the last remnants of his defiance. Before he could muster a response, the sound of an approaching patrol car broke the tense silence. The vehicle rolled to a stop behind David's sedan, and a uniformed officer stepped out. Officer Sarah Hill, known throughout the department for her integrity and professionalism, strode toward the scene. Her crisp uniform and measured stride added an air of authority to the already charged atmosphere. She glanced briefly at Parker, her brow furrowing slightly, before turning to David. "Mr. Collins," she said, her tone softening with respect. "Are you all right? What's happening here?" Parker's eyes darted between Hill and David, panic flashing across his face. You know him," he stammered, his voice cracking. Hill turned to Parker, her gaze sharp and assessing. "This is David Collins, Chief of Internal Affairs," she said firmly. "And from what I'm seeing, it looks like you're not following proper procedure." Parker opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, a woman stepped forward from the shadows. It was the bystander, her phone held steady in her hand. "I recorded everything," she said, her voice clear and resolute. "He planted that bag in the car. You need to see this." Hill frowned and extended her hand to take the phone. As she began watching the footage, her expression hardened with every passing second. The evidence was undeniable. Parker's face turned ghostly pale as the reality of the situation sank in. He swallowed hard, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't mean." But his excuses fell on deaf ears. David stood tall, his voice cutting through the chaos with unshakable authority. "This isn't over, Officer Parker," he said, his tone heavy with finality. "I suggest you start thinking very carefully about every action you've taken today, because this is just the beginning." Meanwhile, Parker, visibly rattled, attempted to justify himself in Hill's presence. "I was just following protocol," he stammered, his voice lacking its usual authority. "I suspected the vehicle was involved in something." Hill's frown deepened, her tone sharp and unyielding. "And what exactly led you to suspect that?" she demanded, her cold gaze piercing through his feeble excuse. Before Parker could respond, another officer, Mike Reynolds, approached the scene. A longtime colleague of Parker, Reynolds initially stood silently beside him, his posture suggesting solidarity. However, as Hill pressed for concrete evidence and the bystander stepped forward with her phone, Reynolds's demeanor began to shift. The woman held her phone out confidently. "I have the video," she said, her voice steady and resolute. "It'll show you exactly what he did." Parker tensed, his hands balling into fists. Desperately, he tried to downplay the situation. "She's just a passerby. Who knows if her video's been edited?" Hill's piercing gaze shifted to Parker, her patience clearly wearing thin. "Are you suggesting we shouldn't review the evidence?" she asked icily. Without waiting for a response, she turned to Reynolds. "Take the phone and review the video." Reynolds hesitated, the tension in the air palpable. Under Hill's unrelenting stare, he reluctantly took the phone and began watching the footage. As the video played, his expression shifted from neutrality to shock, then to grim understanding. When he finished, he turned to Parker, his voice firm and edged with disappointment. "Scott, what is this?" Reynolds asked, holding up the phone. "Did you plant that bag in his car?" Parker stumbled over his words, the panic in his voice evident. I thought maybe he..." "Reynolds, you know me. I was just doing what was necessary." Reynolds shook his head slowly, his voice dropping to a tone of disapproval. "Doing what's necessary doesn't include fabricating evidence, Scott. This has gone too far." Hill nodded at Reynolds, her expression resolute. She resumed documenting the incident, her pen moving decisively across her notepad. For the first time, Reynolds stood firmly on David's side, his shift solidifying the undeniable truth of what had happened. "Step aside, Parker," Hill ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. Left with no way to escape, Parker quietly complied, his head hanging low. The arrogance and bravado that had defined him earlier were gone, replaced by shame and confusion. "I'll be reporting this incident to higher authorities immediately," Hill stated, her voice firm. "Parker, you have the right to explain yourself, but with this evidence, you will be held accountable by both the law and the department." David met Hill's eyes, offering a subtle nod of gratitude, but said nothing. He knew the tide had turned. Parker's abuse of power had been exposed, and justice was now inevitable. Hill turned back to Parker, her voice steady but heavy with finality. "Think carefully about what you've done, Parker, because this isn't going to end here." An oppressive silence hung over the scene as Hill finished her report and secured the evidence. Parker, once so self-assured, now stood slumped, his shoulders weighed down by the gravity of his actions. His face, once filled with smugness, was now etched with anxiety and regret. David remained still for a moment, his sharp gaze sweeping over Parker. He understood that this moment wasn't just about ending the confrontation. It was about delivering a lesson to a man who had misused his authority. Taking a slow, deliberate step toward Parker, David broke the silence. The sound of his shoes on the pavement was almost deafening in the stillness. Standing tall, he locked eyes with Parker, his voice calm yet firm. "The badge you wear," David began, "isn't a symbol of power over others. It's a promise, a responsibility to serve everyone equally, no matter who they are." David's words hit Parker like a hammer blow. The weight of his actions bore down on him, and he realized the potential consequences of what he had done, not just for his career, but for the trust he had broken. Yet, a small part of Parker, scarred by pressure and fear of failure, clung to denial. "I was just doing what needed to be done," Parker muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. David's gaze remained steady, his words cutting through Parker's weak defense. "I'm not here to teach you how to do your job," he said, his tone cold yet purposeful. "But I am here to remind you that your actions today didn't just harm me. They damaged the trust this community places in you, in all of us." Hill lowered her head slightly, a silent acknowledgement of the truth in David's words. This wasn't just a reprimand for Parker. It was a reminder to the entire police force. Taking a deep breath, David continued, his voice softer but no less powerful. "You think this ends here, don't you?" he asked. "But I assure you, this is just the beginning." Parker fidgeted, his mouth opening as if to speak, but David didn't give him the chance. "I will see you again," David said, each word deliberate and precise. "Not on this street, but in the investigation office. And when I do, we won't just be discussing what happened today. We'll be reviewing every action you've taken as a police officer." Parker's face flushed with a mixture of shame and fear. David's words were more than a warning. They were a promise. Turning away, David walked toward his car. As he reached the door, he paused, looking back one final time. "Remember this, Parker," he said, his voice low and sharp. "Respect doesn't come from the badge you wear. It comes from how you choose to wield the power that badge represents." With those final words, David got into his car, closed the door, and started the engine. The vehicle rolled away slowly, leaving Parker standing alone under the piercing gaze of Hill and the onlookers who had witnessed his downfall. As David drove away, the weight of the incident lingered in his mind. To him, this wasn't merely a confrontation with a single officer. Parker was not an isolated individual. He was a symptom of a deeply entrenched culture that had long festered within the system. This wasn't just about one man. It was about a system in dire need of reform. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the blinds of David's office at the Sacramento Internal Affairs Department. Stacks of files sat in neat but imposing piles on his desk, their presence a constant reminder of the uphill battle he faced. Front and center was Officer Scott Parker's personnel file. As David flipped through its pages, his resolve deepened. The file was a mosaic of informal complaints, reports of excessive force, and unresolved accusations of misconduct, red flags that had been ignored or dismissed for years. This wasn't the first time David had encountered an officer like Parker, but he vowed it would be the last time such behavior went unchecked. Picking up his phone, he called for an emergency meeting with his investigative team. By the time the team assembled, David's stern gaze conveyed the gravity of the moment. "We're not just dealing with one officer," David began, his voice steady but heavy with purpose. "We're facing a systemic problem, a culture that has persisted for far too long, and I will not allow it to continue." David recounted the incident with Parker, but he made it clear that this was merely the tip of the iceberg. He instructed his team to investigate not only Parker but also the network that had enabled his behavior. Who had covered for him? Who had turned a blind eye? Every layer of complicity needed to be uncovered. David knew that addressing Parker's case wasn't enough. He was determined to drive systemic reform. Over the course of the meeting, he outlined a comprehensive plan centered on three core pillars: re-education on bias and responsibility. David proposed a mandatory training program for all officers, regardless of rank or tenure. The training would focus on identifying and eliminating unconscious biases while reinforcing the ethical responsibilities and limits of police authority. A badge isn't a symbol of power, David emphasized in a meeting with senior department leaders. It's a reminder that every officer is accountable to the community they serve, strengthening oversight and transparency. To rebuild trust, David pushed for the establishment of an independent review board composed of community members and legal experts. This board would oversee police conduct and handle complaints impartially. He also advocated for the widespread implementation of body cameras to ensure accountability during all police interactions. "We cannot expect the community to trust us if we're not transparent in our operations," David stated firmly. Engaging in dialogue with the community. Recognizing the erosion of public trust, David initiated regular town hall meetings where residents could voice their concerns directly. At the first meeting, the young woman who had recorded Parker's misconduct stood to speak. Her voice trembled with emotion, but her words carried the weight of her community's pain. "We don't need apologies," she said. "We need action. We need to see that the law is fair for everyone." David nodded, his expression resolute. "That is exactly what we're working toward," he replied. David knew the reforms wouldn't come without resistance. Within the department, there were murmurs of discontent. Some officers feared that increased oversight would undermine morale, while others quietly opposed the changes, worried that their own misconduct might be exposed. But David was undeterred. This was more than a professional obligation. It was a personal promise to himself and to the community he served. He wasn't seeking universal approval. He was seeking meaningful change. In the months that followed, David's reforms began to take shape. Training sessions were launched, the independent review board was established, and community dialogues became a regular occurrence. Progress was slow, but each step forward felt like a small victory in the fight to rebuild trust. Back at the Sacramento Police Department, the atmosphere grew tense. The internal investigation, led by David, was carried out with meticulous precision. Every piece of evidence was collected and scrutinized, from the bystanders' video to witness testimonies. Parker was immediately suspended from duty. For an officer accustomed to wielding power and relying on the system's protection, the suspension was a shock, but it was only the beginning. In the sterile confines of the Internal Affairs conference room, Parker sat before an investigative panel that included David and several senior officers. The air was thick with tension, the room eerily silent save for the quiet rustling of papers. Parker shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confidence replaced by a visible unease. David, seated at the head of the table, leaned forward slightly, his expression calm but unyielding. "Officer Parker," he began, his voice steady, "you've been called here to account for your actions. The evidence we've gathered is clear, but this is your opportunity to explain yourself." Parker's gaze darted around the room, searching for an ally, but he found none. His voice faltered as he tried to mount a defense. I was just doing my job," he muttered, his words lacking conviction. David's gaze didn't waver. "Your job," he said slowly, "is to serve and protect, not to fabricate evidence or abuse your authority. What you did wasn't just a violation of protocol. It was a betrayal of the trust this community places in its police force." As David's words echoed through the room, Parker's shoulders slumped. He looked down at his hands, the reality of his situation sinking in. The silence that followed was deafening, a stark reminder of the gravity of his actions. David straightened in his chair, his voice firm but measured. "This investigation is not just about you, Officer Parker. It's about ensuring that this department upholds the values it was created to protect. And I assure you, accountability will be served." The meeting adjourned, leaving Parker to face the consequences of his actions. For David, the work was far from over. The road to reform was long and fraught with challenges, but he remained steadfast in his mission. Each step forward was a step toward a future where justice and integrity would prevail. All eyes were fixed on Parker, who now sat slumped in his chair, a shadow of the arrogant figure he had once been. His fatigue was evident, his confidence eroded. At the head of the table, David's calm but firm demeanor contrasted sharply with Parker's unease. "Officer Parker," David began, his voice measured but heavy with authority, "we are here to examine your conduct in last week's incident. The evidence before us clearly shows a series of inappropriate actions, abuse of power, fabrication of evidence, and discriminatory behavior." Parker shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I was just following protocol," he stammered. "I didn't intend to abuse my authority." "This is all a misunderstanding." David raised a hand, silencing Parker. You call planting a bag of white powder in a citizen's car protocol? Are you aware that the video evidence captured every one of your actions? Parker's lips pressed into a thin line, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if holding on for support. The weight of undeniable evidence had stripped him of any defense. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning, the tension palpable. David leaned forward, his voice steady but firm. Your actions have not only disgraced yourself but have cast a dark shadow over this entire police force. Officers like you make it harder for us to rebuild the trust that is essential between law enforcement and the community we serve. The panel deliberated briefly, though the outcome was never in doubt. The unanimous decision was to terminate Parker's employment, and his case was referred to an independent legal board for prosecution. Parker's face fell further, his once defiant posture reduced to a slumped figure of regret and shame. When the video evidence was made public, it ignited a firestorm. The footage of Parker planting the bag in David's car, coupled with his arrogant demeanor during the confrontation, spread rapidly across social media. Public outrage followed, with hashtags trending and calls for action flooding every platform. Small protests began to emerge, their chants echoing a demand for accountability not just for Parker but for the system that had allowed him to thrive. Signs reading, "Justice for All" and "Reform Now" dotted the streets outside police precincts. Parker became the face of systemic abuse, a cautionary tale of unchecked power. Within the department, the fallout was significant. Colleagues who had once defended Parker, or who had turned a blind eye to his behavior, found themselves under intense scrutiny. Internal Affairs launched reviews of past complaints, ensuring no misconduct would go unnoticed again. David, though gratified by the progress, refused to rest. Parker's case was a reminder that the fight for justice and reform was far from over. During a meeting with department leaders, David's voice carried a solemn warning. "We cannot allow any officer to think they are above the law," he stated firmly. Parker's case is a lesson we must never forget. This isn't just about one man. It's about ensuring this department serves the people with integrity. A week later, David stood on a stage at a large community event. The room was packed, the air buzzing with anticipation. Representatives from social organizations, community leaders, and hundreds of residents had gathered, eager to hear from the man at the forefront of the recent reforms. David approached the podium, dressed in a dark suit that reflected his somber yet determined mood. He paused for a moment, letting the room settle before speaking. "Thank you all for being here today," he began, his voice steady but laden with emotion. "I stand before you not just as the Chief of Internal Affairs, but as a fellow citizen. Someone who has seen firsthand the fractures in a system we trusted to protect us." He scanned the crowd, his gaze meeting individuals who nodded in silent agreement. "The events of last week were not an isolated incident," he continued. "And I know they won't be the last. Unless we commit to real change." David's voice grew stronger, his words resonating deeply. Justice isn't just about holding criminals accountable. Justice means ensuring that every person, regardless of who they are, is treated with fairness and respect. Justice means a police officer's duty is not to impose power, but to protect the rights of others. And justice means that the system we've built serves everyone, not just a privileged few. The room was silent, his words hanging in the air before a wave of applause began at the back and spread forward. The sound swelled, a powerful acknowledgement of the truth he had spoken. David raised a hand to quiet the applause, his expression resolute. "I cannot promise that change will come overnight," he said, his voice softening. "But I can promise you this. I will not stop fighting to improve this system. We will continue retraining, increasing accountability, and listening to the voices of this community. No one in law enforcement will be above the law, and no one in this community will ever again feel as though they don't deserve protection." The applause returned, louder this time, a mix of hope and determination. David stepped back from the podium, his heart heavy with the weight of the work ahead but buoyed by the resolve in the room. In the weeks that followed, David's reforms began to take root. Training sessions on bias and accountability became mandatory, oversight boards were established, and community meetings flourished. Each small step forward marked progress toward rebuilding trust. As David walked through the precinct one afternoon, he overheard officers discussing the changes with a mix of apprehension and acceptance. For the first time, he felt a shift, a realization that the culture he had fought so hard to challenge was beginning to change. The journey was far from over, but David knew this was the beginning of a new chapter, one where justice wasn't just a word, but a promise kept. The entire room rose to its feet in thunderous applause. Some chanted David's name, while others held banners bearing messages of justice, equality, and hope. The energy was electric, not just for David as a person but for what he symbolized, a beacon of change and accountability. In the front row, the young woman who had recorded the damning video stood silently, her eyes meeting David's. She gave him a small nod, her expression one of gratitude and quiet confidence, as if to say she believed in the promise he had made. David stepped down from the podium, moving into the crowd. He shook hands, listened to heartfelt stories, and absorbed the raw emotions of the people surrounding him. Each interaction was a reminder of the depth of pain and the strength of hope within the community. As he navigated through the gathering, a middle-aged man approached him. The man's face was etched with emotion, his voice trembling as he spoke. "Mr. Collins, I was a victim of a similar incident. I had no evidence to clear my name, and my life was completely changed because of it. I'm deeply grateful to you for speaking up and taking action." David paused, placing a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. He met the man's eyes with unwavering empathy. "Thank you for sharing your story," David replied, his voice steady and sincere. "Your experience will not be forgotten. Stories like yours are the reason we fight for reform. You give this work its meaning." Moments later, the young woman who had captured the video approached. She hesitated for a moment before speaking. "I couldn't stand by and watch another injustice happen without doing something," she said softly. "But without you, I don't think this story would have had a fair ending." David smiled warmly, nodding as he responded. "Your courage proves that real change begins with individual acts of bravery. You didn't just record a video, you ignited a movement. Together, we've taken this further than either of us could have imagined alone." Around them, others began sharing their own experiences. Stories of small, daily injustices mingled with accounts of deep wounds inflicted by abuse of power. David listened intently, his expression a mix of understanding and resolve. Each voice strengthened his determination to ensure their pain was not in vain. Raising his voice so the entire crowd could hear, David spoke with conviction. Reform cannot rest on one person alone. It requires the collective effort of the entire community. I need you, not just as witnesses, but as participants, as catalysts for the change we all want to see. The crowd responded with cheers, their unity and determination palpable. As the event concluded, David stepped outside the auditorium. He stood for a moment, watching the crowd slowly disperse, their conversations buzzing with hope and purpose. A sense of relief mingled with the weight of responsibility in his heart. He turned back to the auditorium for one last glance. The image of the people inside, filled with determination and resilience, would stay with him forever. It became a driving force, a constant reminder of why he had chosen this path. David knew the road ahead would be long, the challenges many, but he believed that the foundation for change had been firmly laid. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the first chapter of a much longer journey. David Collins's story isn't just about one man or one incident. It's a powerful reminder that true change begins with each of us. Systems don't change overnight, and justice doesn't happen by accident. It requires courage to question, strength to speak out, and a shared commitment to demand fairness for all. Because in the end, justice and equality aren't just ideals, they're rights. And together, they're rights we can make a reality. What about you? What steps do you think we should take to ensure justice isn't just an idea, but a reality everyone can experience? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If this story resonated with you, please take a moment to like it, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can amplify messages of positive change and inspire action in communities everywhere. Thank you for joining us today. Let's keep striving for a fairer, more just world, One story, one conversation, one step at a time. See you in the next inspiring story.